Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, let's jump right in today. We're looking at something that, looks like a bit of a puzzle in the Bible.
Yeah, a numbers thing, specifically about the Levites in ancient Israel. We've got a whole pile of sources here, texts, notes.
Right, all digging into this question about the age requirements for their service. When could they start?
Exactly. Because you look in one place, it says 30, then another says 25, and later on, it even seems to be 20. It looks contradictory.
So that's our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Let's unpack these sources, figure out these different ages, see how people have tried to make sense of it all.
And maybe find some, practical insights for us today, because what seems like a simple mix-up, it actually points to something pretty sophisticated, I think.
Interesting. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Who exactly were the Levites? Why were they so important?
So the Levites were one of the 12 tribes, descendants of Levi, but they were set apart specifically to help the priests being Aaron's descendants, align within the Levites.
Okay. Assisting with what exactly?
Yeah. With all the sacred duties. First at the Tabernacle, that traveling tent sanctuary in the desert,
Right.
and then later at the temple in Jerusalem, they were crucial.
So not the top priest doing the main sacrifices maybe,
Right.
but essential support.
Absolutely essential. Think about it. They cared for the sacred objects, maintained the holiness of the place, kept things running, and crucially, in the desert, they had the job of actually carrying the tabernacle when they moved.
Wow, okay. That sounds like heavy work.
Definitely. Their service was key to, keeping that connection between the people and God's presence intact.
Got it. Indispensable. So now, let's lay out this age discrepancy. Where's the first number we find?
The first one, and maybe the best known, is in Numbers chapter 4. This chapter is all about the logistics of moving the tabernacle.
The heavy lifting part you mentioned.
Exactly. And Numbers 4, verse 3, it actually repeats this several times in the chapter. It says the Levites doing this work, serving in the tent of meeting for this task, had to be from 30 years old and upward to 50 years old.
30 to 50. Okay.
Yeah.
That feels like a specific range, definitely prime of life, maybe. And you said the context of Numbers 4 is really important here.
Crucial. It's laser focused on that incredibly tough and also incredibly sacred job of transporting the sanctuary and all its holy items. This wasn't just pitching a tent.
No?
Think about carrying the structure, the curtains, the furniture, and for one group, the Kohathites, they carry the most sacred things, like the Ark of the Covenant itself.
Wow. That takes more than just muscle, right? Maturity, focus.
Precisely. The sources really emphasize this 30-50 window as the peak age for maturity and strength. It's needed for these rigorous and sacred duties. It's not just about being strong enough.
It's about readiness, responsibility.
Yes, and the spiritual weight of it. Handling holy things required a certain gravity. It suggests, theologically, that God's system valued capacity and proven readiness, not just, eagerness, especially for tasks so close to his presence.
Okay, so Numbers 4. Age 30 for the demanding sacred transport work. Where does the other number 25 come in?
That shows up just a few chapters later, in Numbers chapter 8. This part of Numbers is about the formal dedication of the Levites, setting them apart for their general service.
A different focus than chapter 4.
Right. And Numbers 8, verses 23 and 24 says Levites come to do service, that's the phrase, in the tent of meeting, from 25 years old and upward. And this service period also ends at 50.
Okay, so Numbers 4 says 30 for service. Numbers 8 says 25 for service, both related to the tent of meeting. That really does look like a direct contradiction on the surface.
It does. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, how do we even begin to square that circle?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because it pushes us to look closer. The most common explanation, certainly in academic circles, is what's called the apprenticeship model, or a training model.
Okay, an apprenticeship. Tell me more. What's the basic idea?
The idea is pretty straightforward, that 5-year gap between 25 and 30. That wasn't for the full-on heavy-duty service described in Numbers 4.
Ah, so they start something at 25, but not the main event yet.
Exactly. It was seen as a time for training, for learning the ropes, maybe doing lighter duties, an apprenticeship, or even a probationary period before they took on the full responsibilities at age 30.
Like an intern phase.
Sort of, yeah. And there's some linguistic evidence that backs this up, which is fascinating. The Hebrew words used for service are slightly different in the two passages.
Oh, how so?
In Numbers 4, talking about the transport, the word is melaka. It tends to mean like official business, skilled work, an assigned task.
Okay.
But in Numbers 8, when it introduces the 25-year-olds, the word is babodath. It's a more general term for work, labor, service. It could imply something less specific, maybe more preparatory or manual.
Wow, that's subtle, but potentially really significant. A different kind of work is implied by the language itself.
It strongly suggests there might be a distinction, and it's not just modern scholars reading into it. Ancient sources saw this too.
Really? Like who?
Well, the Babylonian Talmud, for instance, Tractate Chilin 24a, if you want the specifics, it explicitly mentions training starting at 25 and full service beginning at 30.
Huh. So they debated this back then too.
Oh, yeah. And commentators through the ages, someone like Matthew Henry, described that 5-year gap as a probationary period or discipleship. Modern scholars like G.J. Wenham point out that Jewish tradition generally landed on this apprenticeship idea.
So what would they actually do between 25 and 30, if not the heavy carrying?
Well, suggestions include things like maybe guarding the entrances, opening and closing gates, keeping unauthorized people away.
Okay. Important, but less physically demanding.
Right. Assisting the older Levites, maybe helping set up the outer courts, things that were necessary but didn't involve handling the most sacred items directly or the really strenuous transport. Learning by doing, essentially.
This apprenticeship model makes a lot of sense, actually. It's not just an age gate. It's about development. What does that kind of structured system tell us, maybe about preparing people for important work today, especially sacred work?
I think it tells us that readiness isn't automatic. It's not just about hitting an age or wanting to do something. There's value in a deliberate process, learning, gaining practical experience, being mentored.
Yeah.
This 25 to 30 phase suggests God's design valued the process of preparation, making sure people were truly equipped, not just physically, but with the right skills, reverence, and understanding for these crucial roles. It's almost like an ancient pattern for developing leaders through stages.
That's a great insight.
Yeah.
Okay, so that model really helps reconcile the 25 and 30 for the Tabernacle period.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned another age, earlier 20. Where does that come from? Does that relate to a later period?
It does, absolutely. The age 20 seems to come into play when the whole context of Levitical service changed dramatically.
How so?
With the shift from the mobile tabernacle wandering in the desert
To the permanent temple in Jerusalem, built by Solomon and then rebuilt later.
Exactly. Once the sanctuary wasn't moving anymore, that core, physically demanding job of carrying it just stopped. It wasn't needed.
Right. That changes everything for the Levites' main task described in Numbers 4.
It really does. So their service adapted. In the temple era, their roles shifted more towards things like liturgical service, singing, playing music. 1 Chronicles 23 mentions this specifically in relation to the age change.
Okay.
They also assisted the priests with rituals inside the temple, took care of the building maintenance, handled administrative tasks, a different set of duties.
And who changed the age requirement?
It seems King David initiated it. As he was preparing for the temple his son Solomon would build. 1 Chronicles 23, verses 24 and 27, state that David set the age for starting service at 20.
And it gives a reason.
Yep, the text explicitly says it's because the Levites no longer had to carry the tabernacle or its utensils. The physical burden was lifted, so younger men could begin their service earlier.
Makes sense. Did that age 20 stick?
It seems so. We see it pop up again later, after the exile in Babylon. When Ezra is organizing the rebuilding of the temple, Ezra 3.8 mentions Levites aged 20 and older supervising the work.
Was there maybe another reason for using age 20 then, after the exile, like a practical need?
Yes, that's a really important point the sources bring up. The number of Levites who actually returned from Babylon was, well, quite small compared to before the exile.
Oh, right. You can see the lists in Ezra and Nehemiah.
Exactly. Ezra 2.4 dear, Nehemiah 7.43, they show relatively few Levites came back initially. So lowering the starting age to 20 would have been almost a necessity to ensure they had enough people to staff the temple and get the worship services running properly again.
That's fascinating. It shows the system wasn't totally rigid. It could adapt to real-world circumstances on the ground.
It really highlights a kind of practical wisdom, doesn't it? The core purpose, enabling worship, guarding sanctity, stayed the same. But the specific rules, like the age, could be adjusted, apparently under divine guidance, like with David, to fit new historical realities or logistical needs.
So divine law isn't necessarily inflexible in its application. It has a wisdom that allows it to work effectively in different times and places.
That seems to be the lesson here. Adaptability for the sake of the core mission.
Now, before we synthesize all this, it's probably worth mentioning, as our sources do, that not everyone approaches these different numbers in the same way. There's another perspective in scholarship.
That's right. It's important to acknowledge some scholars, particularly those using source critical methods, look at these different ages, 25, 30, 20, and suggest they might actually come from different historical periods or different layers of tradition within the biblical text itself.
Meaning they weren't necessarily intended as one single unified system from the very beginning.
Potentially, yes. That the rules might have evolved over time and the texts reflect those different stages. Now, today we're focusing on how these texts can be read together, harmonized as a coherent system, which many commentators have done. But it's fair to note that alternative view exists in academic discussion.
Good context to have, thanks. So if we lean towards the harmonized view, putting the apprenticeship idea together with this contextual evolution, how does the picture look?
I think it fits together quite neatly, actually. You have the 25 to 30 period as the training ground, specifically preparing Levites for the very demanding physical and sacred duties of the mobile tabernacle, which required full strength and maturity starting at 30.
Okay.
Then, when the context fundamentally shifts to a stationary temple in Jerusalem, the nature of the primary duties changes. Less heavy lifting, more liturgical and support roles.
Which allows the entry age to drop to 20, as instituted by David.
Exactly. And that lower age also helped address the practical need for more personnel, especially after the exile. So the apprenticeship model explains 25 and 30 in the desert, and the context shift explains the move to 20 for the temple.
That connects the dots really well across the different passages.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the other end of the spectrum? Was there an age limit? A retirement?
Yes, absolutely. The texts are quite clear about that, too. Age 50 was the point of transition.
Transition, not necessarily stopping cold.
Precisely. Numbers 8, verses 25 and 26, says that at 50, Levites shall withdraw from the duty of the service and serve no more. That sounds final, but it specifically refers to withdrawing from the duty or the laborious service, zabah in Hebrew, often implying strenuous work or even military-style service.
So they stopped the heavy lifting, the main official duties.
Yes, the mandatory strenuous tasks. But, and this is really key, the very next verse, Numbers 8.26, clarifies they could still minister to their brothers. They could keep guard and assist.
Ah. So they didn't just disappear, they shifted roles.
Exactly. It wasn't full retirement in our modern sense.
Yeah.
It was a withdrawal from the most demanding aspects of the job. In the temple era, sources suggest this continued contribution could take various forms.
Like what?
Well, things less physically taxing. Maybe continuing to sing in the choirs if their voice held up. Second Chronicles mentions singers. Perhaps teaching the law, the Torah, providing public instruction roles that commentators like Maimonides saw rooted in passages like Deuteronomy 33.0 about Levites teaching Israel.
That's a really beautiful picture, actually. It values their experience, their wisdom. What does that kind of model say about, how communities can view and use the skills of their older members?
I think it shows that service can be, and perhaps should be, a lifelong journey, but one that naturally changes shape as physical abilities change. This system didn't just cast aside the 50-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
It created a framework for their continued dignity and contribution. They transitioned from, say, hard physical labor to roles involving mentorship, oversight, preserving tradition, sharing wisdom. It's about integrating elders, ensuring their experience benefits the whole community and maintains continuity.
That's powerful. Okay, so we started with what looked like a confusing set of numbers about ages, and we've unpacked it into this really nuanced and quite thoughtful system. What are the main takeaways we should hold on to from this deep dive?
Well, first, I think it's clear the different ages weren't just arbitrary numbers. They were part of a carefully designed system for sacred service.
Right. And flowing from that, the big lesson seems to be that meaningful service requires real preparation, proven readiness, and capacity, whether that's physical, mental, or spiritual, matched to the actual role. How the service is done matters deeply.
Absolutely. God seems to care about competence and reverence. Second, that 25 to 30 apprenticeship window really underscores the value of structured training, learning from experienced mentors, and taking on responsibility in phases. It's like a blueprint for developing skilled and dedicated people and passing on vital knowledge.
Yeah, that preparation phase is key. A third point seems to be about adaptability within divine wisdom.
Yes. The specific rule, the letter of the law, like the exact age, wasn't set in stone forever. It could adapt when the circumstances that required that rule changed, like the sanctuary becoming stationary, as long as the core purpose, the spirit, was maintained. Flexibility for effectiveness.
That's a really important principle. And finally,
Finally, that transition at age 50. It shows us that service doesn't have to end when peak physical strength does. It can evolve. Valuing the wisdom and experience of older members, finding ways for them to contribute through teaching, guidance, support, that's vital for a healthy, connected community.
wow. So, yeah, what seemed like a minor biblical discrepancy actually opens up this rich understanding of readiness, training, context, adaptation, and lifelong contribution.
It really does. It reveals a depth and practicality behind these ancient rules that's easy to miss at first glance.
So here's a final thought for you to maybe reflect on. When you consider this journey of the Levites moving through different roles, different age requirements, from intense physical work to liturgical leadership and teaching, how might this ancient model challenge or maybe inspire how you think about the ways individuals contribute to communities or maybe to their church or their vocation throughout their entire lives? How do we better acknowledge changing capacities while still valuing all that accumulated wisdom?
Definitely something to chew on.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.